Listen to that sound. That is the sound of an engine that was never supposed to be here. Over the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, in the year 1943, that growl was a promise and a lie. The promise? American power, ingenuity, a fist of steel reaching across thousands of miles of open sea. The lie? Well, the lie was that this aircraft, the Vought F-4U Corsair, was a failure. The Japanese high command knew about the Corsair. Their intelligence reports, what little they had, dismissed it. They called it whistling death for the noise it made in a dive, but they thought it was clumsy, unmanageable, a plane for second-rate pilots. They looked at their nimble, legendary Zerosen, and they smiled. They had calculated everything except for one thing. They never, ever expected the Americans to bring a gas can. Hello everyone, and welcome to a story of one of the most stunning reversals of fortune in the history of aerial warfare. This is the story of how the US Navy and Marines turned a supposed dud of an airplane into the most feared predator in the Pacific sky. This isn't just a story about a plane. It's a story about a problem so massive, so seemingly insurmountable, that it threatened to strangle the entire American war effort in the Pacific. It's a story of a brilliant, simple, and brutally effective solution that the enemy never saw coming. And it's a story of the young men, kids, really, from farms in Iowa and streets in Brooklyn, who climbed into that misunderstood machine and used it to tear the heart out of the Japanese Empire's Air Force. Today, we're diving deep into one of World War II's most incredible chapters, how the Corsair, with the help of a humble drop tank, came to dominate the skies. Picture this, it's early 1943. The tide is just beginning to turn. Guadalcanal has been a bloody, brutal victory, but the road to Tokyo is still unimaginably long. And the US Navy has a crisis on its hands. Our aircraft carriers are the key to everything, but they're fragile, priceless, and few. To protect them, we need to hit the enemy far from our fleet. We need to project power. But there's a brutal, geographical truth we have to face: distance. The Pacific is enormous. It's a water desert so vast it defies comprehension. And our fighter planes, for all their power and speed, are shackled. They have a leash, a very short one called combat radius. It's the distance a plane can fly out, fight, and still have enough gas to make it home. And in 1943, that radius, it's a joke. It's a defensive perimeter. It's not enough to take the fight to the enemy. The Japanese know this. They've built their entire defensive strategy on it. They call it their unsinkable aircraft carrier, a network of island bases like Rabaul, Truk, Bougainville. They sit, safe and smug, just beyond our reach, believing their pilots and their Zeros are untouchable. They think they have time. They think they have space. They are about to be rudely, violently corrected. To understand the sheer genius of what happened next, you have to feel the weight of that problem. The tyranny of distance. Imagine you're a young pilot, maybe Lieutenant Ken Walsh, a former enlisted man who worked his way up. You're sitting in the cockpit of the most powerful, most beastly fighter plane America has ever produced, the F-4U Corsair. You look at those huge, inverted gull wings. You feel the raw horsepower of that 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine vibrating through your seat. This thing is a thoroughbred. It's fast, heavily armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns that sound like a tornado ripping through sheet metal. It can dive like a falling anvil. On paper, it's a dream. But then you look at your fuel gauge, and the dream hits the hard wall of reality. Your mission briefing is simple. Escort these slow, vulnerable Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers to their target. It's a vital target, a Japanese airfield on Bougainville, from which swarms of Zeros are launching to attack our troops. The bombers are counting on you. Their lives are in your hands. You take off from the deck of the USS Enterprise, the Big E, your heart pounding with a mix of terror and exhilaration. You form up with the bombers and you turn west, towards the enemy. For the first hour, it's calm. Just the endless blue of the ocean below, the white clouds above. But then, the lead pilot's voice crackles over the radio. "That's it, boys. Bingo fuel. We turn back now, or we're swimming home." You look at your map. The target is still 20 minutes away. You haven't even seen the enemy yet. A cold knot tightens in your stomach. You have your orders. You have to leave the bombers. You have to turn your powerful, angry fighter plane around and abandon the very men you were sent to protect. You can barely look the bomber crews in the eye as you peel away. And on the long, silent flight back to the carrier, you know what's happening. Without your protection, the Zeros are falling on those dauntless and Avengers like wolves on a flock of sheep. You can almost hear their screams over the radio, miles away, static and desperation fading into nothing. They are dying alone because you couldn't be there. Because your plane, this magnificent, powerful machine, was born with a crippling flaw. It was thirsty. This happened. Again and again and again. It was demoralizing. It was infuriating. Pilots felt helpless. Commanders were tearing their hair out. The Corsair, this billion-dollar weapon, was being rendered useless by a simple, cruel law of physics. It needed gas. Lots of it. And this is where the irony gets so thick you could cut it with a knife. Because back in the States, the Corsair was getting a reputation. A bad one. The Navy was initially hesitant to carrier qualify it. It had a long nose that blocked the pilot's view during landing, a tricky landing gear that could cause it to bounce, and it was, let's be frank, a handful for a young, inexperienced pilot trying to hit a pitching flight deck. So, the Marines, God bless him, they got it. The Navy, unsure of its new toy, handed the problem to the United States Marine Corps. And the Marines, being the hard-nosed, pragmatic fighters they are, looked at this reject and said, we'll take it. They saw past the flaws. They saw the raw, untamed potential. They were going to operate from land bases anyway. They could tame this beast. But even from land, the problem of distance remained. The Corsair, for all its speed, still had that short leash. The Japanese on Rabaul, in their fortified bunkers, still felt safe. They knew the American fighters could only stay for minutes before their fuel warnings started screaming. They were about to learn that the Americans had a genius for turning trash into treasure and for solving impossible problems with shockingly simple answers. So, how do you solve the tyranny of distance? You can't make the ocean smaller. You can't magically create airstrips hundreds of miles closer to the enemy. Not yet, anyway. The solution wasn't born in a gleaming laboratory or a top-secret think tank. It was born out of pure, desperate necessity. And it was embarrassingly simple. You bring your own gas. Now, this wasn't a completely new idea. The concept of an external fuel tank, a drop tank, had been around. But it had always been an afterthought, a clunky, draggy, inefficient accessory. Early drop tanks were often made of pressed paper or lightweight metal. They were unreliable and they seriously hampered a plane's performance. Pilots hated them. They made your fighter feel sluggish, like flying a truck. In a dogfight, that was a death sentence. But then, a quiet revolution happened in a backroom somewhere at Vought, the Corsairs manufacturer. Engineers looked at the beautiful, brutal lines of the F4U and asked a different question. It wasn't, how can we attach a gas tank to this plane? It was, how can we make the gas tank a part of the plane? They started designing streamlined, teardrop-shaped tanks that fit snugly against the Corsair's belly. They were aerodynamically clean. They didn't create the horrific drag of the old, clumsy tanks. And they held a precious, life-giving cargo, up to 150 additional gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Let me put that in perspective for you. A Corsair's internal fuel capacity was around 235 gallons. This single drop tank increased its range by over 60%. Think about that. It was like giving a marathon runner a set of fresh legs at the 20-mile mark. The tactical implications were earth-shattering. A Corsair taking off from Munda, a newly captured American airfield in the New Georgia Islands, could now fly all the way to Rabaul, the very heart of the Japanese fortress, and still have enough fuel to fight a furious, 20-minute dogfight and get home. It transformed the Corsair from a defensive guard dog into a long-range hunter-killer. But the real beauty, the poetic justice of it all, was in the execution. The drop tank wasn't just extra gas. It was a Trojan horse. A Corsair would take off with this tank bolted under its belly. Any Japanese spotter on a distant island, peering through his binoculars, would see it. And he'd think nothing of it. Just another American plane on a long-range patrol, weighed down, vulnerable. The American pilots would fly, stoic and patient, watching their fuel gauges. They'd approach the combat zone. And then, the flight leader would give the order. "Hey boys, drop tanks." And with a sharp clunk and a whoosh of air, that heavy, empty tank would fall away. And in that instant, the Corsair was transformed. It was suddenly what it was always meant to be: lean, clean, and lethal. Shedding that tank was like a prize fighter taking off his heavy training robe and stepping into the ring, fists up. The Japanese pilots, confident, often complacent, would see the American fighters and think they had the advantage. They'd see the drop tanks fall, and for a split second, maybe they'd be confused. Why were they jettisoning fuel? Were they desperate? That split second of confusion was all a Corsair pilot needed. Because he wasn't low on fuel. He was now at his fighting weight. And he was about to introduce the pilot of a Mitsubishi Zero to a very, very bad day. Let's make this personal. Let's go back to that frustrated pilot, Lieutenant Ken Walsh. The one who had to turn back and leave the bombers to their fate. Now, imagine him a few months later. It's August 1943. He's part of Marine Fighter Squadron 124, the very first Corsair squadron to be deployed in combat. He's sitting in the same cockpit. But this time, there's a 150-gallon drop tank hanging under his plane. The mission is the same: escort bombers to Bougainville. But the feeling is entirely different. This time, when the flight leader would normally have given the order to turn back, there's only silence on the radio. The formation presses on. Walsh watches the coastline of the enemy-held island appear on the horizon. His heart isn't sinking with dread anymore. It's pounding with a focused, cold fury. He checks his guns. He makes sure his safety harness is tight. He's not a defender anymore. He's a hunter. And then they appear. Specks in the distance, swelling rapidly into the distinctive, graceful, but fragile shapes of Mitsubishi A6M0s. They come in, overconfident, expecting the Americans to be low on gas, hesitant, maybe even easy pickings. Walsh later recalled the moment. He saw the Zeros forming up for their head-on pass, a favorite tactic. He took a deep breath. He keyed his mic, "Tanks away." Across the formation, the heavy, empty canisters fell away, tumbling into the vast blue below. The Corsairs, instantly lighter, more nimble, began to climb, to gain the energy advantage. What happened next was a slaughter. The Zero was a fantastic dogfighter at low speeds. It could turn on a dime. But it had two critical weaknesses. It couldn't dive, and it had no armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a glass cannon. The Corsair pilots didn't try to turn with them. That was suicide. They used their newfound energy. They'd climb, then dive like falcons, their 6.50 calibers roaring, spitting out a torrent of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. A 2-second burst was often enough to turn a Zero into a fireball. Walsh, in that single engagement, would shoot down 2, maybe 3 enemy planes. He wasn't just protecting the bombers, he was annihilating the threat. He was paying back every single bomber crew he'd ever been forced to abandon. He was the long arm of American justice, finally able to reach out and touch the enemy who thought he was safe. The flight home was different too. It was long. The pilots were exhausted, sweat-soaked, their ears ringing from the engine noise and the gunfire. But there was a new feeling in those cockpits. A feeling of grim satisfaction. Of accomplishment. They had done it. They had taken the fight to the enemy's doorstep, kicked in the door, and won. They had proven that the problem wasn't the plane. The problem was the fuel. And they had just solved it with a piece of metal that cost less than a family car. So, by the middle of 1943, the pieces were in place. The failed Corsair, adopted by the tough-as-nails Marines, was now equipped with a simple, brilliant device that gave it the one thing it desperately needed: range. The Japanese, confident in their island fortresses and the reputation of their Zero, were about to experience a shockwave. But this was just the beginning. This new weapon, this new tactic, needed to be tested in the crucible. It needed a proving ground, a battle so fierce, so consequential, that it would shatter the enemy's will. The Americans had the tool. Now they needed the anvil. And that anvil had a name. A name that would become synonymous with hell on earth for Japanese aviators. The US military called it Operation Cartwheel. The pilots who fought there would simply call it the turkey shoot. But how did this technological edge translate into total aerial domination? How did a simple gas tank lead to the near total destruction of an entire generation of Japanese combat pilots? And what was it like to be a Zero pilot, watching in horror as the plane you were told was inferior outdove, outclimbed, and outgunned you at every turn? The story of the slaughter over Rabaul is next. Don't go away. The sound begins low, a deep-throated rumble that doesn't so much fill the air as dominate it. It's the growl of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders of pure American anger. Now, layer that sound over a visual of the most brutal, beautiful fighter plane ever to claw its way into the sky. The Vought F-4U Corsair. Its inverted gull wings give it a hunched, predatory stance, like a bird of prey about to strike. But this bird is caged, because this sound, this magnificent, terrifying sound, is trapped. It's the summer of 1943. Below this Corsair isn't the rolling deck of a fleet carrier, but the dusty, hacked-out runway of a place called Munda Point on New Georgia. It's a jungle hellhole, hot, humid, and crawling with mosquitoes. The Marines who fly and maintain these machines are living in mud, eating sea rations, and fighting a war not just against the Japanese, but against the environment itself. And they're fighting against a myth perpetuated by their own navy. You see, the Corsair had a reputation. A bad one. The Navy brass thought it was too hot, too powerful, too dangerous for their precious carrier decks. That long nose blocked the pilot's view on final approach. It had a vicious port wing stall characteristic. It could bounce on landing. To the carrier admirals, it was a problem child. So they gave it to the Marines. And the Marines, being who they are, looked at this rejected, temperamental, overpowered masterpiece and said, perfect. They didn't need a perfect carrier plane. They needed a killer. And from these rough, forward airfields, these unsinkable aircraft carriers of dirt and coral, they would prove just how lethal this so-called failure could be. But there was still that cage. The cage of distance. The Corsair's combat radius on internal fuel was about 350 miles. That sounds like a lot, until you look at a map of the Solomon Islands. The Japanese fortress of Rabaul, the very heart of their air power in the South Pacific, sat nearly 400 miles away. It was a dagger pointed at the entire Allied advance. And it was, for all intents and purposes, just out of reach. A Corsair pilot taking off from Munda could fly towards Rabaul, but by the time he got even close, his fuel gauge would be dipping into the red. He'd have maybe 10-15 minutes of combat time before he had to turn tail and run for home, or else ditch in the shark-infested seas. It was maddening. The Japanese knew this. They calculated their safety based on these numbers. Their pilots, the veterans of the Zero, would often press their attacks with an arrogant confidence, knowing the Americans were operating on a timer. They would loiter just beyond the theoretical limit, taunting. They knew the Americans had the better dive, the heavier firepower. But they had the range, or so they thought. Because in the sweltering heat of Munda, a revolution was being bolted onto the belly of every Corsair. It wasn't a new gun, or a new bomb sight, or a secret radar. It was a sleek, teardrop-shaped pod of aluminum. A 150-gallon drop tank. The effect was instantaneous and transformative. That 350-mile radius suddenly stretched to over 550 miles. Rabaul was no longer a distant, untouchable fortress. It was now a target. The cage door had been thrown wide open. The first missions with the drop tanks were a psychological earthquake for both sides. For the Marines, it was a feeling of liberation. The long, silent, anxious flights where they'd watch the fuel gauge more than the sky were over. Now they could fly deep into enemy territory with confidence. They could hunt. For the Japanese, it was a terrifying puzzle. Their spotters on the coast would report the American formations coming in. They'd see the drop tanks, of course. And they'd assume, logically, that these were heavily laden, vulnerable planes, probably on a reconnaissance run or a bombing mission, easy prey for the nimble Zeros. The Corsairs would fly in, seemingly sluggish, holding their formation. The Zeros would scramble, climbing to gain altitude advantage, their pilots eager for what they thought would be an easy fight against fuel-starved Americans. Then, at the perfect moment, the American flight leader's voice would crackle over the radio. Just 2 words: jettison tanks. All across the formation, the heavy, empty canisters would release, tumbling away into the vast blue below. And in that instant, the Corsairs were reborn. The drag vanished. The engines, no longer straining against the extra weight, seemed to scream with renewed power. The planes felt light, agile, and deadly. The Japanese pilots, seconds before so confident, now felt a cold dread. These weren't vulnerable, fuel-conscious opponents. These were fresh, fully armed hunters who had just shed their training weights. The psychological shock was a weapon in itself. This new reality demanded new tactics. The Marines couldn't just fly out and hope for the best. They had to become masters of energy fighting. The Corsairs' great advantage was its speed in the dive and its rugged construction. The Zero's advantage was its incredible turn radius. A Corsair pilot trying to dogfight a Zero in a horizontal turning battle was a dead man. So they developed the boom and zoom. They would use their dive speed and climb rate, their energy, to dictate the terms of the fight. They'd come in high, out of the sun if they could. They'd pick a target, push the nose over, and dive like a thunderbolt. The Zero, light and fragile, couldn't follow them down. The Corsair pilot would line up his shot in the dive, his 6.50 caliber machine guns hammering, a 2-second burst enough to shred the thin-skinned Japanese fighter. Then he'd use his incredible speed to climb back up, away from the fray, safe from the turning Zeros below. He'd reset, and then he'd do it again. It was like a hawk attacking a flock of sparrows. The sparrows were more maneuverable, but the hawk controlled the sky above them. It was a terrifying, demoralizing way to fight. And nobody exemplified this new breed of hunter better than a quiet, determined pilot from New York City, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. Boyington was a legend in the making, a man with a complicated past and a natural, almost savage, talent for air combat. He was given command of a new squadron, VMF 214. The press would later call them the Black Sheep. Boyington understood the Corsair and the new possibilities of the drop tank better than almost anyone. He was an aggressive, brilliant tactician who used the Corsair's strengths mercilessly. He led his Black Sheep on long-range fighter sweeps over the very heart of Japanese power. They weren't just escorting bombers anymore. They were going out looking for a fight. Their goal was to draw the Japanese up, to annihilate their air power in the sky. And the Japanese, bound by their code of Bushido and their overconfidence in the Zero, almost always obliged. The stage was now set. The tool was perfected. The tactics were honed. The hunters were in place. All that was needed was the final, decisive confrontation, a battle of such scale and ferocity that it would break the back of Japanese air power in the South Pacific once and for all. That battle was coming. The Americans had a name for the operation. The Japanese pilots, those who survived, would simply remember it as their graveyard. The sound you're hearing now is not just one Corsair. It's a dozen. It's a score. It's an entire air group, engines synchronized into a symphony of impending violence. They are lined up on the runway at Munda, at Ondanga, at Baracoma. Each one carries a drop tank, full of the fuel that will take them to the enemy's doorstep. The pilots, men like Boyington and Walsh, check their instruments, their gun sights. They feel the old, familiar mix of fear and anticipation. They are no longer the hunted. They are the hunters. And they are about to unleash hell over Rabaul. The turkey shoot is about to begin. The air at Munda was thick, not just with humidity, but with tension. You could taste it, a mix of sweat, aviation fuel, and fear. It was the morning of October 17, 1943. On the revetments, the Corsairs of VMF 214, the Black Sheep, were being prepped. Crew chiefs swarmed over the gull-winged fighters, their hands moving with a practiced, urgent rhythm. They were bolting on the sleek, teardrop-shaped 150-gallon tanks. Today wasn't a defensive patrol. Today, they were going hunting. Greg, Pappy Boyington, a man whose personal demons were as well known as his tactical genius, stood on a crate near his plane, a map of the Solomon Islands spread out before his pilots. His voice was a low growl, cutting through the drone of idling engines. "Listen up. Intel says the Zeros have been reinforcing Kahili and Balale airfields on Bougainville. They think they're safe. They think we can't reach them with enough gas to put up a real fight." He paused, a grim smile playing on his lips. "We're going to show them they're wrong. We're taking the fight to their front porch. We jettisoned tanks here, just south of the Treasury Islands. That gives us 30 minutes of pure, unadulterated hell to unleash over Bougainville." One of the younger pilots, a kid from Ohio named Miller, shifted his weight. 30 minutes, Pappy? That's a long time over there." Boyington fixed him with a stare. "It's long enough to make them wish they'd never heard of Pearl Harbor. Remember your drills. We don't turn with them. You see a Zero, you climb. You get above him. You become the hammer. He is the nail. You dive, you fire, you climb. You do not, under any circumstances, get suckered into a turning fight. That's what he wants. That's how you die." The flight out was a study in grim anticipation. The 12 Corsairs climbed to 20,000 feet, the drone of their double Wasp engines a monotonous hymn. Below, the Solomon Sea was an endless, empty blue. Each pilot was alone with his thoughts, the hiss of oxygen in his mask the only company. They watched their fuel gauges, the numbers ticking down, their lifeline to home. Miller, in his cockpit, kept running his gloved hand over the toggle switch for the drop tank. "Don't forget. Don't you dare forget to drop it." Then, Boyington's voice, calm and clear, shattered the silence. "Black Sheep, this is leader. Tanks away. Now." A chorus of clunks echoed across the radio as 12 pilots hit their releases. Miller felt his Corsair lurch upwards, suddenly light, eager, and fierce. The drag was gone. The engine note sharpened. It was like a racehorse feeling the reins go slack. They were now pure fighter. They crossed the coast of Bougainville. The jungle was a deep, impenetrable green. And then they saw them. Not specks, but a swarm. 20, maybe 30 Zeros, climbing to meet them. They'd been spotted. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by the raw arithmetic of aerial combat. "Okay, boys." Boyington's voice was almost conversational. "Here they come. Stick to the plan. Climb and dive. Climb and dive." The sky exploded into a chaotic ballet of death. Tracer fire stitched patterns in the blue. Zeros, incredibly agile, whipped into tight turns, their pilots seeking to get on the tail of the heavier Americans. But the Corsairs didn't play that game. They followed Boyington's orders. They climbed. Miller shoved his throttle to the firewall, the G-forces pressing him back into his seat as his Corsair angled sharply upwards. A Zero tried to follow, but it bled energy, slowing, becoming a target. Miller glanced back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Don't turn. Don't turn." He kept climbing. From above, the fight looked different. It was no longer a confused melee, but a series of calculated, lethal opportunities. He saw a Zero, its distinctive red circular insignia bright in the sun, latched onto the tail of another Corsair. Miller rolled inverted, pulled back on the stick and dove. The world compressed into his gun sight. The roar of the wind and the engine became a single scream. The Zero grew larger, filling the ring. He could see the pilot's head, a dark blob in the cockpit. He waited. He heard Boyington's voice in his head. "Make it count." His thumb pressed down on the trigger. The 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted with a sound like canvas ripping. Tracers reached out, a stream of fire and lead that walked up the Zero's fuselage. Pieces flew off the Japanese plane. A flash of orange, then a bloom of dirty black smoke. The Zero rolled onto its back and spun down, a comet of fire into the jungle below. Miller didn't watch it hit. He was already pulling back on the stick, climbing again, his eyes scanning the sky for the next threat, the next kill. This was the new reality. The Corsair pilots, empowered by their range and disciplined in their tactics, were systematically dismantling the myth of Japanese invincibility. The Zero was still a deadly opponent in the hands of a veteran, but it was fragile. A short burst was often fatal. The Corsair, by contrast, could take a phenomenal amount of punishment and still bring its pilot home. Men would land with cylinders shot off, wings holed, tail sections shredded, but the tough airframe held together. The fight over Kahili lasted less than 20 minutes. When the black sheep turned for home, the sky behind them was empty of enemy aircraft. 7 Zeros had been confirmed shot down. They had lost one Corsair. It was a rout. On the flight back, the radio was silent for a long time, each man processing the violence, the adrenaline crash, the sheer, stark reality of survival. Then, a voice crackled over the channel. It was Miller. "Skipper? I got one." Boyington's reply was laced with the ghost of a smile. "I know, kid. I saw. Now shut up and watch your fuel. We're not done yet." This was the pattern now. Day after day, the Corsair squadrons, Marine and, soon, Navy in New Zealand, would launch with their bellies heavy with extra fuel. They would range further and further, striking airfields, intercepting bombers, engaging fighters. The psychological impact on the Japanese was devastating. Nowhere was safe. The unsinkable carriers were being systematically sunk from the air. The Zero pilots, the proud sons of the samurai, found themselves in an impossible position. Their doctrine, their training, their very aircraft were built for the short-range, turning dogfight. They were being defeated by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. The Americans struck from above, with overwhelming force, and then vanished. It was a new kind of war, and the Japanese high command was slow, fatally slow, to adapt. The climax was building. The Americans were preparing for their next giant leap, the invasion of Bougainville itself. To succeed, they had to neutralize the greatest threat of all, the massive Japanese air complex at Rabaul. It was the lion's den, and the Corsairs, with their long-range tanks, were the only ones who could lead the charge. The stage was set for the most intense, sustained air campaign of the Pacific War. The final, bloody reckoning for control of the skies was just over the horizon. The shark's mouth painted on the nose of Pappy Boyington's Corsair seemed to be grinning. It was a cold, mirthless grin, the grin of a predator that has just found the feeding grounds. Standing on the wing route, Boyington scanned the horizon to the west, towards a place that had become an obsession, Rabaul. "They're in there, boys," he said, his voice low enough that only his black sheep, gathered around him, could hear. "The whole damn Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force is sitting in that volcano crater, fat and happy. They think their flak and their fighters make them untouchable." He lit a cigarette, the flame trembling slightly in a breeze that felt electric. "We're going to teach them a new word. Attrition." The plan was as brutal as it was simple. Operation Cartwheel wasn't a single, decisive battle. It was a war of inches, a grinding, bloody process of strangulation. And the Corsair, with its newfound legs, was the perfect instrument. The orders from Admiral Halsey himself were clear. Hit Rabaul. Hit it again. Then hit it again. Don't let them sleep. Don't let them breathe. Make every sortie cost them planes they cannot replace and pilots they cannot train. The first fighter sweeps over Rabaul were a shock to the system for both sides. For the Americans, it was the sheer scale of the defenses. The Simpson Harbor was a forest of ship masts, and the airfields surrounding it, Lakunai, Vinakana, Tobra, bristled with anti-aircraft guns. The sky, when the Corsairs arrived, would literally fill with black, puffy clouds of flak, a lethal garden blooming instantly around them. And then the Zeros would come. Not in 2s and 3s, but in waves. Dozens of them. These were not the inexperienced pilots from the outer islands. These were the veterans, the squadron leaders, the men who had fought since China. They came up with a ferocity born of desperation. They were defending their home. The initial engagements were pure, unadulterated chaos. A Corsair pilot named James "Slick" Goodwin described it later. It was like flying into a kicked-over beehive. They were everywhere. You'd shoot one down and 2 more would be on your tail. You'd brake left, dive, climb, your head on a swivel, your heart trying to punch its way out of your chest. The radio was a cacophony of shouts, warnings, curses. Brake right. Brake right. There's one on your tail. Slick? I'm hit. I'm hit. The disciplined boom and zoom tactics that had worked so well over Bougainville were tested to their absolute limit. There were simply too many targets, too many threats. Pilots found themselves forced into turning fights, the one thing they were told to avoid. The Corsairs' ruggedness was its salvation. Men saw Zeros explode from a short burst, while their own planes absorbed hits that would have sheared the wings off a lighter aircraft. They landed with gaping holes in their wings, with control cables hanging loose, with engines smoking, but they landed. The toll, however, was immense. The Black Sheep lost 2 pilots on their first Rabaul sweep. They came back silent, the euphoria of victory replaced by the hollow ache of loss. In his tent that night, Boyington didn't celebrate his 2 kills. He drank neat whiskey and stared at the 2 empty cots. But the math was inexorable. The Americans could replace their losses. The pilots they lost were tragic, but new ones were already in the pipeline, training back in the States. The Corsairs they lost could be rebuilt, shipped out, and rolled off the production lines in their thousands. The Japanese could not. Every Zero shot down over Rabaul was a permanent subtraction. The pilot in that cockpit was often a battle-hardened veteran with years of experience, a man who was literally irreplaceable. The aircraft itself, built by hand in workshops, was a dwindling asset. The industrial might of America was now being felt in the most personal way possible, in the skies over a captured Australian town in New Britain. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical. The Corsair pilots began to develop a terrifying reputation. The Japanese started calling them angels of death. The sight of those distinctive gull wings high above, glinting in the sun, became an omen of doom. A new pilot arriving at Rabaul would be told, "Beware the bent-wing devil." It bred a specific kind of fear. You couldn't outrun it. You couldn't outdive it. All you could do was try to outturn it, and even that was a gamble with death. The pressure on the Japanese command was immense. They had to stop these daily attacks. They made a fateful and ultimately fatal decision. They would commit their last, best reserves. They would send in the elite. The very best pilots from the carrier divisions, the men who had planned and executed the Pearl Harbor attack, were ordered to shore-based duty at Rabaul. It was a desperate gamble, throwing their aces into a meat grinder to try and stop the bleeding. The Americans, through code breaking and reconnaissance, knew they were coming. The stage was set for a clash not just of machines, but of legends. It happened on the morning of November 1st, 1943. A massive fighter sweep of over 80 Corsairs and Hellcats was headed for Rabaul. They knew it was going to be big. The atmosphere in the ready rooms was tense, solemn. Boyington gathered the Black Sheep. "Today," he said, his voice gravelly, "you're not just fighting for the Marines. You're fighting for every guy on the beach at Guadalcanal. You're fighting for the sailors on the Arizona. Make it count." As they crossed the St. George's Channel, the radio chatter from the coast watchers confirmed it. Many bogies. Repeat, many bogies rising from Lacunae and Vianakina. Estimate 60 plus. Then they saw them. It was an awe-inspiring, terrifying sight. The sky ahead was filled with a swirling mass of aircraft, a kaleidoscope of Zeros, Oscars, and Tonys. This was it, the full might of Japanese naval aviation. The fight that followed was the absolute peak of the air war in the South Pacific. It was not a single dogfight, but a dozen simultaneous, desperate battles spread across 50 miles of sky. Pilots fought until their ammunition was gone, then used their propellers to chop at enemy planes as they disengaged. In the middle of it all was Boyington. He was in his element, a master tactician conducting a symphony of destruction. He led his flight, climbing, diving, his guns barking. He was a magnet for enemy fighters. At one point, he found himself alone, for Zeros on his tail. He dove for the deck, skimming the waves of the harbor, the Zeros following. He led them straight into his own squadron's ambush. It was a slaughter, but the Japanese aces were skilled, brave, and deadly. They knew the Corsairs' weaknesses and exploited them. They tried to force low-speed fights. They attacked from below. The American formations were broken up, the fight devolving into a series of individual duels. A young Corsair pilot, his plane shot to pieces, parachuted into the harbor. He was seen, treading water, as a Japanese landing craft sped towards him. Then, from out of the sun, a lone Corsair dove. It was his wingman, ignoring the tracers filling the air around him, making a single, low pass over the landing craft, its .50 calibers chewing up the water and forcing it to turn back. It was an act of insane, selfless courage, a testament to the bond between pilots. When the Americans finally turned for home, low on fuel and ammunition, the sky was clearing. The sea and jungle below were littered with the burning wreckage of over 30 Japanese aircraft. The Americans had lost 11. It was a tactical victory, but the strategic victory was far greater. The Japanese elite, their best and brightest, had been thrown into the fight and had been decimated. They had failed to stop the Corsairs. The myth of their invincibility was shattered. The raids continued, day after day. The quality of the Japanese opposition began to visibly deteriorate. The sharp, aggressive attacks of the veterans were replaced by the hesitant, clumsy maneuvers of raw, hastily trained replacements. The Corsair pilots, now hardened veterans themselves, could see the difference. The fight was going out of the enemy. The siege of Rabaul was working. The once mighty fortress was being bled white from the air. The Corsair, the plane the Navy didn't want, flying from islands they'd only just captured, had achieved the impossible. It had reached out and strangled the strongest Japanese base in the Pacific. The road to Tokyo was now open. But the cost had been paid in the blood of young men, men who looked at a map, saw a target just beyond the horizon, and found a way to reach it. The air over Rabaul had changed. It was no longer the contested, lethal space it had been just months before. The constant, thrumming dread was gone, replaced by an eerie, hollow silence. Where once dozens of Zeros would scramble to meet the incoming Corsairs, now only a handful rose, their movements sluggish, almost resigned. Greg "Pappy" Boyington led a flight of 4 Corsairs on a mid-morning sweep in late January 1944. The mission was routine now, almost perfunctory. They flew over the ravaged airfields. Lakunai was a moonscape of craters. The skeletal remains of hangars stood blackened against the green jungle. At Vunakana, a few forlorn Zeros were visible, scattered and camouflaged, trying to hide from the relentless eyes in the sky. Black sheep leader to flock. Keep your eyes open, Boyington's voice crackled, but the old edge was dulled by fatigue. They circled, predators in an empty savanna. They saw no movement, no flak burst around them. The great anti-aircraft batteries were silent, their crews dead, out of shells, or simply broken. "Where are they, Pappy?" a young pilot asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. "They're gone, son," Boyington replied, his tone flat. "Or what's left of them is hiding in a hole. The spirit's been shot out of them." It was the quiet culmination of a storm. The unrelenting pressure of the Corsair raids, the daily, grinding attrition, had achieved its strategic goal. The Japanese High Command, facing an impossible calculus of losses, had made the decision. Rabaul was to be bypassed and neutralized. The elite air units, what remained of them, were withdrawn. The great base, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was left to wither on the vine, its garrison imprisoned by American sea and air power. The Corsairs had not just won the sky, they had made a fortress irrelevant. On January 3, 1944, Boyington's luck finally ran out. On a mission to finish the job, he was shot down over the St. George's Channel. He would spend the rest of the war in a prison camp, his personal war over. But the machine he had helped perfect, the tactic he had mastered, did not die with his capture. The doctrine of the long-range fighter sweep, enabled by the humble drop tank, was now gospel. It would be carried forward by new aces, in new Corsairs, all the way to the Japanese home islands. The impact was profound and irreversible. The Japanese aircraft industry, in a desperate attempt to counter the Corsair, rushed new designs into production. The Kawanishi N-1KJ George was a formidable opponent, arguably the first Japanese fighter that could meet the Corsair on near equal terms. But it was too little, too late. It arrived in small numbers, plagued by production problems, and was thrown into a losing battle against a foe that now had numerical, technical, and tactical superiority. The myth of Japanese technological and pilot superiority lay in the jungles of Rabaul, rusting next to the shattered remains of the Zero. The human cost was etched on the faces of the men who returned. They came back to Hawaii or San Diego, thinner, older, their eyes holding a distance that their families couldn't quite bridge. They had left as boys, eager for adventure. They returned as men who had looked into the heart of darkness and carried a piece of it back with them. They had lost friends, wingmen who simply vanished into the blue vastness or erupted into fireballs before their eyes. The victory was sweet, but it was a bitter sweetness, paid for in a currency of youth and innocence. The Corsair itself flew on, its legend secure. It would provide crucial close air support at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, its distinctive whistle in a dive becoming the last sound many Japanese soldiers ever heard. By the war's end, Corsair pilots had achieved an astounding kill ratio of over 11-to-1 against Japanese aircraft. It was a testament to the machine, yes, but more so to the men who flew it and the simple, brilliant innovation that unlocked its true potential. So, what became of the unsung hero of this story? The drop tank? It became standard equipment. The lesson was learned and absorbed into the very DNA of American military aviation. The need for range, for the ability to project power and protect the bomber, became a cornerstone of air combat doctrine. You can draw a direct line from the 150-gallon tank under a Corsair's belly over Rabaul to the conformal fuel tanks on an F-15 Eagle streaking over Baghdad. The problem of distance was solved not by magic, but by ingenuity, by a refusal to accept the limits imposed by the enemy. The story of the Corsair and its drop tank is more than a tale of a single weapon. It is a story of American resilience. It's about looking at a problem everyone else calls impossible and asking, what if? It's about taking a tool that others have rejected and seeing its hidden potential. It's about the quiet, unyielding courage of the maintenance crew chief who bolted on that tank for the 100th time, the intelligence officer who pieced together the enemy's weakening state, and the young pilot from Ohio or California who climbed into the cockpit, scared to death, and flew into the hell over Kahili because it was the job that needed doing. The growl of the Corsair's engine faded from the Pacific skies, but its legacy did not. It was the plane that broke the back of an empire, the key that unlocked the tyranny of distance. It proved that no enemy, no matter how confident or entrenched, is safe from the combination of innovation, industrial might, and the indomitable spirit of free men.